Christmas is widely regarded as one of the best times of the year. Children get a break from school, families catch up with their loved ones, and crisp air burns your lungs. I'm not ashamed to admit that Christmas is one of my favorite holidays. I love the lights, the caroling, and the general atmosphere of love and warmth. But for one unfortunate West Virginia family, Christmas Day in 1945 would be one of the worst days of their lives. Worse still, the case of the Sodder children is still unsolved, and the last remaining survivor of the fire, Sylvia Sodder, passed away in 2021. But did something sinister and unthinkable really happen? Or is it possible that these strange series of events were really just an accident? Hey besties, and welcome to the Crafty Crimes podcast. Today, we have an unsolved case to talk about that has been part of West Virginia lore for nearly 80 years now. I first heard about this case from Ryan and Shane on BuzzFeed Unsolved years ago, and then just kind of forgot about it until my best friend Alex brought it up to me recently. So everyone say thank you, Alex, in the comments section. In looking back into this story, I fell down a rabbit hole hoping to find that with years having passed, the world would have some answers by now. But ultimately, there's no real conclusion. So while we look back into this vintage mystery, I'm going to practice some new stitches, hopefully to make a cute top with this summer. If you've been watching my TikTok, you know I've been struggling with crochet burnout recently, so I hope just moving my hands will help me get back into it. So, grab your crafting supplies and learn about the disappearance of the Sodder children and practice your stitches with me. Our story begins in Italy with young George Sodder. George was born on the island of Sardinia off the coast of Italy on November 23, 1895, as Giorgio Sodder. Italy as we know it now was still relatively new when George was born. The country was still struggling with the power shift and with skyrocketing rates of poverty. The United States saw a large influx of Italian immigrants, including the star of today's episode. In 1908, at 13, Giorgio and his older brother began their trip to the United States. But when the brothers arrived at Ellis Island, Giorgio stepped off the boat alone. 13-year-old Giorgio was left alone in a foreign country with no funds and no way to communicate with the world around him. With nowhere to go and nothing to his name, Giorgio made his way to Pennsylvania and began working on the railroads. At some point, he adopted the more Americanized version of his name, George Sodder. Sometime in the 1920s, George made his way to West Virginia, which had a large Italian-American immigrant population at the time. According to the data from the Census Bureau, about 23% of West Virginia's population was Italian-born in the 1940s, which is the decade that this story primarily takes place in. At the time of his move, George had traded his days laying railroad tracks for hauling coal with his own trucking company. What an amazing turnaround, by the way. From abandoned in a foreign land to a business owner, George was living his version of the American dream. George was considered to be an outspoken man who talked a lot about everything, which would become especially problematic following the disappearance of his children. One of George's most controversial opinions involved the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. George was incredibly outspoken about his disdain for the leader, which during World War II, when this story takes place, was not a great opinion to have. His outspoken character, mixed with his reticence to discuss leaving his mother country, is what really leads most people to the mob theory that we're going to discuss towards the end of this episode. And while I don't necessarily want to disparage the theory, I can say that there are any number of reasons why George moved across the ocean. As I mentioned earlier, the country wasn't very stable at the time. About 9 million Italians moved to America around the same time George did, and another 7.5 million immigrated out of Italy and landed somewhere in Europe. Some people really just need a fresh start, and he wouldn't be the only child sent away by a family to protect them. Jose Menendez, who I talked about in episode 7, was sent away before Fidel Castro could completely ruin Cuba. But regardless of the reasons, George made it in the US only to lose everything in a mysterious disaster years later. Moving to the mountain state changed George's life in more ways than one. While at a music store near Fayetteville, George met a young Jenny Cipriani. Not much is really said about Jenny. I attribute this to the time she was born in. We, meaning women, were kinda in limbo in the 1920s, where we were no longer seen as the property of the men in our lives, but we still hadn't quite gained autonomy yet. And as such, our personal histories weren't logged as well as that of the men. What we do know about Jenny is that she was born in Foggia, Italy on March 2nd, 1903, making her 8 years younger than the man she would marry. Jenny immigrated to the US as a toddler with her family and was working in her father's music store when she met George. By 1922, the pair would be married. They welcomed their first child, John Sodder, into the world about a year later in 1923. John is the eldest of the 11 Sodder children. The youngest, Michael, would be born 5 years after the tragedy and pass away just one day after being born. How unfair to Jenny. 2 of her children had been drafted, 5 disappeared in a fire, and 1 died within a day of being born. That poor woman's heart must have been broken, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. The Sodders lived happy, simple lives. Despite George's outspoken disdain for Italian dictator Mussolini, the community overall viewed the family in a positive light. A county magistrate even described them as one of the most well-respected families in Fayetteville. It may have been that most people in the community had similar opinions, and George was just the one to put a voice to them. So, how and when did things go wrong for this unassuming average family? Great question. The story really starts in 1945, when a series of strange events preceded a fire that left the family home in ashes and the Sodders with 5 less children. The strange events started around October 1945 when an insurance salesman visited the Sodder home. Allegedly, this salesman had been previously employed by George and had co-signed on the family's home insurance, which is weird because the man who sells you insurance can't be your co-signer, at least not in today's world. Allegedly, the insurance salesman had also increased the policy amount without the family's knowledge or consent, which if he really were the co-signer on the policy, he would have been able to do. So now you see why the salesman can't be the co-signer. So when he turned up on the Sodder's doorstep again, George sent him away, and that apparently really ruined that man's day. George claims that before the insurance salesman left, he cursed the family and made an odd statement. Supposedly, the salesman screamed that the Sodder house would burn and their children destroyed. Specifically, according to George, he said, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." Very oddly specific threat to make, but I guess people do say some pretty wild things when they're mad. On some other unspecified date, the Sodders claim that a man from town came around their property asking for work. Apparently, he just kind of helped himself to a tour around the property and made an odd comment to George about some bad wiring being likely to cause a fire. This might not mean much to us. Quite frankly, I think that's pretty neighborly. But George found the comment strange because he just had the house rewired by an electrician a few months prior. A strange act before the fire was witnessed by the eldest children in the weeks before the fire. 17-year-old Marion and 16-year-old George Jr. claimed to have seen a couple men sitting in an unfamiliar car and supposedly watching the younger Sodder children walk home from school. I keep saying supposedly and allegedly and claim because, as it often is with these older cases, information is pretty scarce. The story of the Sodder children lives as mostly a legend, and the majority of the story is based around speculation from neighbors, newspaper readers, and the family themselves. And I think the story keeps hanging around because there isn't any good explanation that answers all the questions this case leaves behind. The main event starts on Christmas Day. It had snowed recently and there was still a light dusting on the ground. The cold winter wind was blowing. Jenny had hung Christmas lights in the windows, and 17-year-old Marion had brought home some toys from work for her younger siblings. The younger children begged their parents to stay up late to play with their new toys. Jenny, the loving and patient mother she was, agreed to let them stay up and reminded them to do their chores and lock up the house before going to bed. Then Jenny, George, 23-year-old John, 16-year-old George Jr., and 2-year-old Sylvia turned in for the night. Marion stayed up with her other brothers and sisters while they played. Time around 12:30 in the morning, Jenny woke to a phone call. She quickly answered and informed the caller that they had the wrong number. Looking around, Jenny said she noticed Marion was asleep on the couch with the lights on. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, the younger children, weren't in the living room at this time, so Mrs. Sodder assumed that they had gone to bed and had forgotten to turn off the lights. Closing up the home for the night, Mrs. Sodder returned to bed. And it literally just dawned on me that this is my second historical fire with missing children case. If you missed the first one, it was about Belle Gunnis in episode 6. Very different case, and if you go back and watch that episode, you'll see what I mean. Please go watch it. It's like my worst performing video. Technically, it's still a mystery, but I mean, is it really? We all know what happened on the Gunnis farm. Sometime later, Jenny awoke to a loud thump on the roof and the smell of smoke. She roused George, Marion, and baby Sylvia and headed outside. The older boys, John and George Jr., shared an upstairs bedroom and made it outside with their hair singed. But the 5 younger Sodder children, all of whom shared the other upstairs bedroom, never emerged from the fire. George and Jenny were frantic. George tried yelling up the stairs for the kids, but the stairs were already swallowed by flames, so they wouldn't have been able to leave their room even if they had heard George call for them. George was determined to save his children. He tried to break a window and re-enter the house, but the flames were too intense. He tried to move his coal truck closer to the home and climb on top to pull the kids out of the window, but the truck wouldn't start. He even tried to scoop rainwater out of a barrel with his hands to try to quell the fire enough to get inside, but being winter in West Virginia, the water had frozen. And perhaps most breaking of all was the ladder. George swears that he always kept a ladder propped against one side of the house, but on the night of the fire, it wasn't there. The fire would be found 30 to 40 feet from the house only after the fire had already died. George and Jenny stayed outside the house, screaming for their children. But they weren't the only ones desperate to save the kids trapped inside. Marion ran to a neighbor's house and begged them to call the fire department. But that neighbor called and couldn't make it through to the operator. Another neighbor saw the blaze and attempted to call the operator themselves, but they got no response as well. In desperation, someone ran into town and found Fire Chief Morris in a bar. From there, a long-winded game of telephone was played in order to collect enough volunteers to respond, which was super common for volunteer firefighters at the time. Firefighters finally arrived around 8 a.m., 7 hours after the fire had started. The fire station, by the way, was only like 2.5 miles from the Sodder house, so a 7-hour response time is actually crazy, even if they had to ring every volunteer individually. Thank the powers that be that emergency response protocols have significantly improved since 1945 so that we don't hear about stuff like this as often. This is also where I want to take a pause in the story. While I was researching this case, I found myself returning to Jenny. Maybe it's because I'm also a mother and can't imagine living through these things, but my thoughts kept returning to her. Her 2 eldest sons had been drafted in a war that, prior to Pearl Harbor, most Americans wanted nothing to do with, and it's quite possible that they were facing fellow Italians on the opposite ends of their rifles. This was likely the first time the boys had left their country, and it was to fight their cousins in a globally devastating war. That alone is a mindfuck. But then 5 of her children either went missing or died in a fire. And after decades of searching, she'd received no answer and die without knowing what happened to half her family. And as if all of that wasn't enough, several years later, the Sodders would lose their newborn son just hours after his birth. Obviously, all of these things are tragic for the entire family. None of them were left unaffected. I would certainly be shaken to my core if one of my siblings died. However, I know a mother's love runs much deeper and is much deeper ingrained than the love of a sibling. And while I'm sure a father's love runs deep as well, I'm not a man, so I can't tell you about how harrowing this would be for a loving father like George. So, I especially mourn with Jenny. 1943 to 1968 seemed to be especially hard on her, and she was only 37 years old when this tragedy struck. According to a state police officer who arrived on scene, Jenny was doing her best to bear up bravely under the weight of the tragedy. Okay, let's get back to the story now. The family claims that the fire raged for about 45 minutes before it reduced the structure to nothing salvageable. The firefighters who arrived on scene searched the rubble for clues as to what happened and for the remains of the 5 Sodder children that never made it out. By 11 a.m., the search was finished, and George, consumed by grief, used the tractor to cover the house's foundation with 5 to 6 inches of dirt. Jenny would later turn this site into a flower garden in memory of her children. Now, it's said that remnants of the home's appliances were still discernible in the rubble and ashes, yet no trace remained of 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, a daughter named after her mother, and 5-year-old Betty. This led to the surviving Sodders to believe that the children had not been in the house during the fire and that perhaps they had been taken. I don't think I need to tell you that the volunteer fire department absolutely shit the bed on this case. I know I'm swearing a little more in this video, but I've seen my video demographics and we're all adults. I think you can handle a few naughty words. Anyway, the fire department obviously botched this in every conceivable way, and to be totally candid, George Sodder ruined whatever evidence could have been left when he bulldozed the area immediately after the fire. But everyone else who worked on this case also dropped the ball in pretty big ways. Without any bodies and no helpful witnesses to the fire, a coroner's jury was called. A coroner's jury is a group of 6 to 20 people within a county or a town that's called in to review the evidence the coroner has collected regarding a death. The purpose is to help determine if foul play is involved. These citizens do not go to trial, and they just review the evidence before an arrest is even made. In the case of the Sodder children, the coroner's jury was called to determine if the fire was intentional or accidental. And though the Sodders wouldn't know it for another 2 years, the insurance salesman who supposedly threatened George was on the jury. On December 30th, 1945, 5 death certificates were issued for Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Their cause of death was listed as fire or suffocation. This resolution did not satisfy any of the surviving Sodders. While I believe that this case has a pretty benign and ordinary explanation, every single Sodder family member, including grandchildren, maintain that something more sinister happened. Even though the investigation was short and not at all thorough, investigators did find something strange. The Sodders' telephone line had been cut, but none of their neighbors' telephone lines had been touched. Now, while this is probably the most sinister clue, and honestly it is kind of strange, a cut phone line without explanation is hardly cause to believe anything malicious had been planned. If I'm being totally honest, there was a lot of activity around the Sodder house that night, so a friend of one of the boys who still lived at home could have cut the phone wire as a prank. I don't think something like that is outside the realm of possibility. Regardless of how the family or neighbors felt, the official cause of the fire is listed as faulty wiring. Jenny believes that the phone line was cut shortly after the strange phone call, just 30 minutes before the blaze started. That's not the only reason they believe something sinister happened. Marion, the eldest daughter, swore to her death that they never saw the younger children in the windows, never heard them scream, and never smelled burning flesh. George also told everyone that he had the wiring checked just earlier that year when they added a telephone to their property. And Jenny swears that all the lights in the house were on while the house burned down. Most newspaper reports surrounding the fire mention that the night was quite windy. Aidan Mattis of Lore Lodge, another podcast in the mystery business, will tell you that the wind was blowing away from where the family stood, which could have moved the scent away. And he does some really solid research, so I feel pretty comfortable leaning on that for this little detail. So, maybe the wind did blow the smell away from the family. Additionally, Sylvia, the 2-year-old, found a hard rubber ball in the yard during a visit to the memorial. George claims that the hard ball came from a pineapple hand grenade and that it had to be what Mrs. Sodder heard on the roof the morning of the fire. I believe that it is far more likely that Sylvia found a lost toy. Hand grenades, specifically pineapple grenades, didn't utilize rubber balls until after World War II, so there would have been no way for one to have been thrown at his house. I also find it unlikely that a 2-year-old girl, a baby really, just happened to find something that implies that the family was the victim of a targeted attack rather than a freak accident. As for the truck that wouldn't start, a local man had admitted to stealing the engine block out of George's truck. The investigators had also followed up on the weird phone call, and that turned out to genuinely just be a wrong number. So like I said, everything has a pretty reasonable explanation. Now, to the Sodders' credit, they had received some tips immediately after the fire about sightings of 4 out of the 5 kids. The oldest boy, Maurice, wasn't among the children reported to have been seen again after the fire. A hotel keeper, an innkeeper, someone who provides short-term lodging for a price, saw the other 4 missing children at her hotel in Charleston. She said they were accompanied by 2 Italian men and 2 Italian women, and that the adults froze her out and refused to let her speak to the kids. This was about a week after the fire. The tip from Charleston was not the only tip that came in about the kids. There were alleged sightings as far out as Texas, and George personally looked into every cold trail. By 1947, the Sodders had hired private investigator C.C. Tinsley to investigate the case, and the only thing he turned up from his investigation was the detail about the insurance salesman being on the coroner's journey, which we briefly talked about earlier. Was this a conflict of interest? Yeah, absolutely. But with no other new or hard evidence, what can you do? Declare 5 kids that no one has really seen hide or hair from in 2 years not dead? Sodder had also written a letter to J. Edgar Hoover of the newly founded FBI to ask him to investigate. Initially, Hoover believed it was outside the FBI jurisdiction, but rescinded that decision when Tinsley got involved. The FBI ceased their investigation sometime in 1949. As an aside, anyone who has heard of this case before probably recognizes the name C.C. Tinsley. Great name for a detective. And I bet he got a lot of business from having a cool name like that. But his real name is Oscar Cole Tinsley, and that's not as cool. I would probably go by C.C. too. Still unsatisfied with the answers they were given, George and Jenny hired an independent lab analyst to look at the dirt that had been used to cover the smoldering house. You see, since the fire, Jenny had been conducting at-home experiments to see if she could get bone to turn to nothing but ash, and she swears she never could. It was around this time that Jenny also went and spoke to a crematorium employee to ask about the cremation process. What she learned is that bodies burn at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for about 2 hours with occasional stirring to reduce a body to ash. The employee also told Jenny that bone fragments were always left behind. I'm going to take another quick break from the narrative to tell you what I learned about house fires and burning bodies while researching this episode, and then I will tie it back into my theory at the end. So the average house fire burns at 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit at its hottest point. And while that's about 500 degrees cooler than what a crematorium runs at, it's also not unreasonable to think that prolonged burn time at those temperatures could very well lead to cremation. So, even though I applaud Jenny's scientific curiosity, her experiments were poorly conducted and didn't match the conditions of the house fire. I can say that, by the way, because I am the proud owner of 2 science degrees and have had to design experiments. Furthermore, the firefighters who investigated the fire believed that George inadvertently created an oven by covering the smoldering rubble of the home with dirt, meaning that the kids burning to ash is even more plausible. The independent analyst brought in to take some samples of the soil George used to cover the house's foundation was Doctor of Pathology Oscar B. Hunter. In August of 1949, Dr. Hunter sent the samples to the Smithsonian labs to be analyzed. Now, there were bone fragments found in the dirt. Pieces of 4 separate vertebrates were found. Unfortunately, the bones were determined to belong to a 16 to 20-year-old male, and if you remember, the oldest child to disappear was 14. The Smithsonian also noted that the bones they received showed 0 signs of having been exposed to fire, leading to the conclusion that the bones were already in the dirt when it was laid. I gotta wonder too if the boy in the dirt is another unsolved case. This story is just dripping with tragedy. Dr. Hunter did comment on the investigation, saying that it was unusual to not find any fragments of skulls or pelvic bones specifically, which would have been the hardest to cremate and the last to burn. George was present during Dr. Hunter's investigation and made sure to point out that several pieces of the house that were quite flammable, such as roofing or tubing, were also left over and in the rubble. I guess he was trying to prove that the fire wasn't that hot, so clearly the children weren't in the house at the time. How he jumped to kidnapping is still a mystery, and he was asked by a journalist who would take his children. He sidestepped the question and insisted that the more important query was their whereabouts. Due to the analytical evidence, one of the best private eyes at the time, and the FBI all suggesting that nothing suspicious had happened, the state of West Virginia was forced to take action. The governor, Oki Patterson, issued a press statement outside the Capitol building declaring the case closed and the 5 Sodder children dead. It was in the winter of this year, 1950, that George and Jenny welcomed their son Michael into the world. Tragically, baby Michael would pass away within a day. I genuinely cannot imagine that type of pain, and I don't want to. My heart goes out to Jenny and to any of you who left the hospital without your baby. Obviously, if we've learned anything about George and Jenny so far, it's that they were very unsatisfied with the results of every single official investigation. They remained convinced that something was being covered up, and they demanded to know why. Getting no more help from state or federal law enforcement, the Sodders called on their neighbors to help bring their kids home. This led to the erection of the famous billboard along Route 16 in 1952. The billboard featured the names, ages, and photos of the missing kids, and a blurb about the fire and a cover-up. Several tips from all over the United States made their way to George because of this billboard, probably because they offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to their safe return. Every tip turned up nothing, though, and honestly, I'm not surprised because this was like 7 years after the fire. Sometime in 1968, maybe before George died or maybe after, it's honestly pretty hard to narrow down because sources vary wildly when it comes to exact dates in this case, a postcard was sent to Jenny from Kentucky. The postcard contained a picture of a man in his mid-20s that the family believed to be Lewis. Their boy and the man in the photograph do look similar, I'll admit. But with the general area housing well over 14,000 Italian immigrants and folks of Italian descent, I'm not really surprised that they look similar. People who originate from the same country typically have similar features, not to mention the changes that one's face goes through between childhood and adulthood. The weird thing about the postcard, though, is the writing on the back. It said, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, I lil boys," followed by a seemingly nonsensical sequence of numbers. The message is odd because there was no Frankie Sodder. Unsurprisingly, the Sodders hired another private investigator to find the origin of the postcard. They never heard from the PI again. On nothing but a hunch, the updated picture of Lewis was added to the billboard. George passed away on August 16th, 1968, at the age of 73. No one has heard anything about the Sodder children since the 1968 postcard. Jenny Sodder passed away on February 15th, 1989, at the age of 85. She wore black every day of her life after the fire to show her mourning over her lost children. One by one, the 5 remaining children passed away, with the youngest, Sylvia, passing away in 2021. Sylvia's daughter, Helen, is the last relative fighting to keep this case from becoming forgotten to history. Helen believes wholeheartedly that her aunts and uncles were stolen away in the night, which I think is an absolutely insane belief to hold about people you've never met and an incident you weren't alive for, especially because her mother would have no working memory of any of these events either. Sylvia was 2 when the house burned down, so everything she knew is what everybody else told her, and the same goes for Helen. Now that we've finished the timeline, I want to get into the theories that have surfaced over the years. I'm going to give you the 3 theories that I believe to be the most likely, and then I'm going to share the fan favorite theory, which has no merit in my opinion. The first one seems to be our best contender, and it was presented to us by our pre-production assistant, Abby. If you remember from high school, the Great Depression coincided with World War II, and it was actually the war that produced enough jobs to pull the country out of that hole. George was a coal trucker trying to support a family of 12 during the Depression, and Jenny didn't work and took care of the farm and the kids. It's not all that hard to imagine that the family was struggling financially with so many mouths to feed. Prior to the insurance salesman showing up at the Sodder house, George had increased the insurance amount on his own home. However, he had claimed that the insurance salesman was the policyholder from the house and had increased the premiums instead without his knowledge. And as we talked about earlier, that's just not how that one works. Furthermore, Abby found a key piece of information that is left out of most articles covering this case. In addition to the ladder that was kept on the side of the house, there was also a tall tree next to the home that was allegedly close enough to the house that someone could enter or exit the house from it. George actually suggested to investigators that whoever stole the children may have climbed this tree to get the upper level. If that's the case, then one has to wonder why George, or his recent army discharged 23-year-old son, didn't try to climb the tree and get the 5 kids that were trapped inside. With this information in mind, it seems that George Sodder took a page out of Belle Gunnis's book and committed insurance fraud by starting the fire. He then either sold 5 of his children for additional cash, which wasn't uncommon at the time, or the kids were just collateral damage for a money grab scheme. In fact, a respected detective, George Swain, believed it was highly likely that the children were sold to new families. He cited an article in the September 1948 issue of Reader's Digest that suggested adoption was difficult because of the thriving black market for babies. If the children were trafficked, this would explain why there was no sign of them in the ashes. However, the biggest issue with the insurance fraud and trafficking theory is that all of the investigators and firefighters said that there was no evidence of arson. It also doesn't explain why the 5 children that were sold never returned home as adults, nor does it explain why the surviving children maintained their father's charade. We also don't know what the financial situation really was here, so was it insurance fraud to make ends meet or an ill-timed accident? next theory that I want to float to you is the one that I've held since the start, and that is that the fire genuinely was a freak accident and George accidentally made an oven that disintegrated the bones of his kids. In the case of house fires, you are far more likely to die of smoke inhalation than burning to death. And thank the gods for that, am I right? Burning just sounds like such a horrible way to go. If the fire started in the kids' room, then it's pretty reasonable to assume that the kids succumbed to suffocation pretty quickly, which would explain why they were never seen in the window or heard crying out. The winds pointed out by the newspapers and Ada Mattis could have carried the smell away. If you remember, the remains of the house were still hot and smoldering when Fire Chief Morris arrived on the scene. As I mentioned in the previous theory, Morris maintains that he tried to do a thorough search of the rubble, but after just a couple of hours, and before he could find anything, George insisted on covering the area with dirt. The bulldozer and dirt being laid down would have damaged any remaining evidence, and this was done within 10 hours of the onset of the fire. George didn't even give it a full day before destroying the scene, and I quite literally cannot wrap my brain around why he would do that. And, as I've mentioned multiple times now, arson was ruled out entirely, but that's also not the only way for a home to burn down. It could have very well been an electrical fire like the firefighters suggested. Or, if the daily heat in their home came from a fireplace, then an ember could have escaped while someone stoked the fire and just smoldered until something caught. Or, because we know it was windy that night, a strong gust of wind could have blown in, scattered embers, and started the fire. The wind could have also picked up something dense that then dropped on the roof and woke up Jenny. The biggest problem with believing this really was a freak accident surrounded by weird coincidences is that it truly does not explain the lack of evidence to suggest the kids died in the fire. It could be possible that George created an oven that reduced his kids' bones to ash when he added the dirt to the foundation, but then that wouldn't explain the bones found years later that had been exposed to the same conditions. It was also brought to my attention that blacksmiths and potters have to add air to their forges and kilns to get their fires hot enough for their respective work. So, if the kids really did die in the fire, why were there no bodies found? And why was George so eager to cover up any trace of them in the home's remains? The internet loves to jump to insane conclusions about things that are mysterious, and this case is no exception. I'm gonna say up front that I don't believe this version of events one bit. However, it's the fan favorite. The Italian mob kidnapped the Sodder children. Before I tell you why I think this is absurd, I'm going to tell you why it's so popular, other than that everybody loves a bad guy. As we discussed in the beginning of the episode, West Virginia had a decent-sized Italian immigrant population, and when people think of the mob, they typically think of Italy. It was rumored that George had turned down an offer for some unspecified job with whatever mafia presence was in the area. The rejection, coupled with George's outspoken dislike for the Italian dictator, allegedly angered the mob, so they kidnapped his kids to send a message. Now that it's all laid out like that, knowing what you know now, doesn't that just sound ridiculous? And if it doesn't sound absolutely bonkers yet, let me explain. There is no way a group of people would have been able to sneak into the home, walk upstairs, take 5 kids from their beds, the eldest to be taken was 14 by the way, and snuck back out without waking anyone up. If you recall, the first suspected sighting of the missing kids was in Charleston with 4 adults. 4 adults are not breaking into a home and kidnapping 5 people without notice. It's just not happening. That means that they would have had to take the kids when they went outside to finish their chores for the night. But that entire idea hinges on all 5 kids going outside in the dead of night. The second glaring issue with them being taken before the house caught on fire is that we know with 100% confidence that people were up and awake at the time the fire started. A neighbor, without prompting, saw the blaze and tried to call the fire department. Someone had run through the backyard and cut the phone line. A woman had mistakenly called the family late that night. The fire chief was at a bar drinking. There was just so much activity going around in close proximity to the house that it's highly unlikely that no one saw anything that could corroborate George and Jenny's kidnapping theory. Detective Swain, the same one from the trafficking theory who had the inside scoop on the underground child market, did suggest that the children may have been lured out or otherwise incentivized to leave on their own volition, perhaps with the promise of a big Christmas party. But again, there was a lot of activity around the Sodder house that night, and no one recalls seeing them around town. The other major problem with the mob theory is that they would have had no connection to George. Fayetteville is a small town, so we really gotta ask ourselves what the mob would want with a small town coal trucker. I suppose you could say that George had already been in trouble with the mafia previously, and that's why he moved to the US. And that seems to be everyone's idea of what happened. But here's the thing. Sardinia is an island in the Mediterranean Sea off the west coast of Italy. So there's really no mob presence there. And overall, there are way too many holes for the mob theory to get any real credit in my book. And that, my friends, is the unsolved disappearance of the Sodder children. Almost 80 years after a devastating fire cost a family everything, we still don't know conclusively what happened. Maybe it was insurance fraud, maybe it was a freak accident, maybe it was trafficking. I guess the only people who really know were the people involved, and they are long dead. Whatever happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, I hope it was painless. Thank you for hanging out and practicing your craft with me. Remember to choose kindness where you can, and check back in soon for the tale of the original milk carton kid. In the meantime, shoot me an email or follow me on socials.